ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe.
It's the year 1942, 5 years after World War II started, and a doctor just arrived in Germany. He is an original German native, but has been traveling round the world expanding his knowledge on diseases. This doctor has just learnt about malaria from Africa and believes he can use it as a weapon against German enemies. But would he succeed? Or would everything come back to bite him in the face? This is the story of how one Nazi doctor wiped out thousands of people with one disease. But when did everything start? It all started with World War II. World War II is a touchy subject, but many of the injustices in the world can be traced back to that era. The war was fought by 50 countries in different parts of the world, both on land, air, and sea. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in the world, and started because of Adolf Hitler, the man who gave an opportunity to the Nazi doctor that ended up killing over 1,000 people. So here is how it all started. After the devastation of World War I, also known as the Great War, Europe was terribly destabilized and there was still a lot of unresolved conflict between the countries involved in it. The greatest evidence of this conflict was seen in the political and economic instability in Germany, coupled with the lingering resentment over the harsh terms imposed by the Versailles Treaty. This treaty required Germany to return Alsace-Lorraine to France, cede Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium, return northern Schleswig to Denmark, and concede West Prussia, Posen and Upper Silesia to the newly re-established Poland. But this was only a tip of the iceberg for the things that the treaty demanded of Germany. The country lost all its overseas colonies as they were placed under the administration of Allied powers by the League of Nations mandates. The German army was only allowed to have 100,000 troops with no conscription, and they had to take full responsibility for the war while paying 130 billion gold marks, which was the equivalent of $33 billion, as reparations to the Allies. Germany was also prohibited from forming any political or economic union with Austria, but the Great Depression that followed paved a way for Austrian Adolf Hitler to make his way to power. Germans already had mixed feelings about the parliamentary republic as the left and right-wing extremists were taking over. The moderate political parties could not control the tide of extremism, but more Germans started leaning towards Nazi ideologies because of the German referendum of 1929, which challenged the harsh conditions of the Versailles Treaty. There was a better plan called the Young Plan, which managed to reduce the overall amount owed by Germany and extend the payment period to 59 years. But the German referendum kicked back and claimed that it was embarrassing to even want to pay anything at all. They managed to win the fight against the Young Plan, which ushered in a new ideology in Germany. Through this move, the Nazi Party went from living in obscurity to becoming the second largest party in the parliament. The elections of 1930 led to the breakup of a grand coalition and the replacement by a minority party with the appointment of Heinrich Brüning as Chancellor, and he governed through emergency decrees.
Germany, which is putting all her energies to the gigantic task.
From President Paul von Hindenburg, governance by decree ushered in an era of dictatorship, which would make way for Adolf Hitler's era. During this period, it was illegal for Reichswehr officers to be members of the Nazi Party, as they were still considered an extremist group. So when 2 Reichswehr officers were going to appear in court for their involvement with the Nazi Party, Hitler used that as his opportunity to get into the heads of the people. During the trial, the prosecution argued that the Nazi Party was an extremist group, and Adolf Hitler took the stand as a witness to testify against that. He claimed that his party would pursue political power through democratic processes, which earned admiration and support amongst the officer corps. Heinrich Brüning's method of ruling wasn't effective, and the economy didn't experience any kind of growth, but the people that were majorly affected by this were lower-class members of the society, like farmers. So Adolf Hitler exploited the inflation at the time and focused his message on the people who were suffering, promising them a better life. Obviously, they gravitated towards him because they were looking for any glimmer of hope, and he provided that. In 1925, Hitler revoked his Austrian citizenship, but also didn't apply for German citizenship and was at risk of deportation. By 1932, he was appointed as administrator of Brunswick's delegation by the state governor, which automatically made him a citizen of Brunswick, therefore also a citizen of Germany. He eventually ran for presidency in 1932, and despite having the support of many industrialists and religious groups, he came in second. Despite losing, he had built the persona of a strong political force to the German people. Little did they know what lay ahead for the German government wasn't effective at the time, and because of that, two influential political figures, Franz von Papen and Alfred Hugenberg, wrote a letter to the then president to appoint Adolf Hitler as chancellor. They encouraged the president to make Hitler the leader of a government independent from parliamentary parties, which could turn into a movement that could enrapture people. The president reluctantly agreed, and in 1933 he was appointed chancellor alongside two other Nazi party members who were appointed Minister of Interior and Minister of Interior of Prussia. Hitler insisted on becoming chancellor because he wanted control and access to the police in Germany, which he eventually got. After getting the position he wanted, the Nazi Party started gaining more ranks in the parliament, and they started to press their opposition. They gained full control of all the arms of government, and the other parties were intimidated to disband. The cabinet then passed a law that stated that when the current president dies, the office of president would be dissolved, and its power would be merged with that of the chancellor. By 1934, the president died, and Adolf Hitler was declared head of state and supreme leader, and that was when the German people started to realize that maybe that wasn't what they really wanted. But it was already too late. With his rise to power came more hardship for the German people, and in no time, a Second World War started to brew, which would eventually lead to the rise of the Nazi doctor that destroyed a lot of Jews. The start of World War II. After Hitler became head of state, he started showing his obsession with the superiority of the German race, which he called Aryan. He believed that war was the only way to gain living space or Lebensraum for the German race to expand. His obsession led him to secretly begin the rearmament of Germany, which was a violation of the Versailles Treaty. During this time, he also signed alliances with Italy and ended Germany's partnership with China to partner with Japan. Hitler's alliance with Italy and Japan allowed him to go against the Soviet Union. In 1938, he sent troops to occupy Austria, and the next year, he annexed Czechoslovakia. Hitler's actions went unchecked for more than a year, as the United States and the Soviet Union were concentrated on internal politics, and the other nations devastated by the First World War were not eager for another confrontation. Eventually, the Soviet Union leader, Joseph Stalin, sat with Adolf Hitler and they reached an agreement. They signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which incited worry and panic in London and Paris. To Stalin, the Soviet Union was now safe, but to Adolf Hitler, it was his opportunity to invade Poland. Great Britain and France had guaranteed military support to Poland in case it gets attacked by Germany. With the pact, it meant the Soviet would offer assistance to Germany instead of going against them, which meant Hitler wouldn't have to face war on two fronts. It seemed like he was a smart war strategist, but at what cost? On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany, beginning World War II. Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east on September 17, and Poland fell quickly as Germany and the Soviet Union had divided control over the nation. It was with the start of this war that a concentration camp was built in Germany, which paved the way for the Nazi doctor who annihilated hundreds of people. Introduction to Dachau. After Germany took over Bavaria in 1933, the chief of police in Munich, Heinrich Himmler, started to gain interest in an unused gunpowder and munitions factory. He started to convince the administration that they could use the factory for quartering protective custody prisoners, so he was given the go-ahead to do what he wanted. Himmler then started to tour the site to see how he would go about his plans, and on the 22nd of March, 1933, the concentration camp at Dachau was opened. On the opening day, they moved in 200 prisoners from Stadelheim prison in Munich and the Landsberg fortress, which was where Hitler was first imprisoned before he started his reign of terror in Germany. Heinrich Himmler announced in the nation's newspaper that the camp could hold up to 5,000 people and described it as the first concentration camp for political prisoners. He claimed that the prison would be used to restore calm in Germany, and since the Germans were already convinced that anybody against Nazi ideologies was the enemy, they didn't ask further questions and instead celebrated the opening of this prison. It became the first regular concentration camp established by the coalition government of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also called the Nazi Party, and the German National People's Party. Dachau soon started receiving more prisoners, but they weren't always people that had committed crimes. Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals and emigrants were being sent to the camp after the 1935 passage of the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were a set of anti-Semitic and racist laws that institutionalized racial hierarchy, which paved the way to the persecution of the Jews. The law defined who could be considered a German citizen, and according to it, only those of German or related blood could be Reich citizens and enjoy full civil and political rights. Jews were classified as subjects of the state and stripped of their citizenship, leaving them without legal protection and political representation. Based on the law, there was also no way for them to get citizenship, as it also prohibited marriages and extramarital relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. The law also forbade Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 in their households to prevent racial contamination. It also criminalized the display of the German flag by the Jews, so patriotism could not benefit them. But in all this, the most amusing part was what was defined as Jewish identity. A Jew was defined as someone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents, and if a person had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents, they were classified as Mischlinge, also known as mixed race. They had varying degrees of restrictions based on their classification. The Nuremberg Law marked the formal segregation of Jews in Germany and led to the Holocaust, as the regime was more confident to persecute Jews as they liked. But the allowance of this law said more about the German people than it did about Adolf Hitler. Despite denouncing his Austrian citizenship, Adolf Hitler was not of pure German blood, but he was obsessed with it, and the German people allowed him to feed their delusions and claw his way to supreme leader. Going back to Dachau concentration camp, they used prisoner labor to initiate the construction of a large complex, capable of holding 6,000 prisoners. The construction started in early 1937 and was completed in mid-August 1938. Anyone who opposed Adolf Hitler or his party was sent to the new prison, and in just 1938 alone, 11,000 German and Austrian Jews were sent to the camp, especially after the annexation of Austria-Sudetenland. By 1939, hundreds of Sinti and Roma were sent to the camp, and in 1940, over 13,000 prisoners were sent to the camp from Poland. Representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross inspected the camp in 1935 and 1938 and reported on the harsh conditions. The camp seemed to have exceeded its capacity by more than 100%, so what exactly was going on there? The reality of the Dachau camp. The camp was initially built to use the prisoners for forced labor, but with access to power sometimes comes a lack of critical thinking. Between 1941 and 1943, over 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were murdered by the Dachau Commandant's Guard at the SS Totenkopfverbände shooting range as the camp started doubling as a training ground. The murders were a clear violation of the provisions laid down in the Geneva Convention for Prisoners of War, which required that prisoners of war should not be executed or tortured. They were also to be treated humanly, but that wasn't in Adolf Hitler's books. After murdering the prisoners, the SS used the term Sonderbehandlung, which meant special treatment to refer to what they had done. The camp continued to increase the number of prisoners they held, and by 1942, it had exceeded 12,000. A place that once held communists, leading socialists, and other supposed enemies of the state soon started to hold German Jews whom the Nazis sent there. So what was built to hold their enemies soon started to hold their people, which makes us wonder how they felt when what they thought wouldn't turn against them actually turned against them. When the imprisonment of Jews started, they were offered permission to move overseas if they voluntarily gave their property to enhance Adolf Hitler's public treasury. But after giving up your property, what would be left for you? Almost nothing, which means you may have no means of moving out of Germany. Once Austria was annexed and Czechoslovakia was dissolved, the citizens of both countries became the next prisoners at Dachau. But at the time the prison was eventually liberated, they had more Polish prisoners than any other nationality. The gates to the prison had the inscription Arbeit macht frei, which meant work sets you free.
The Arbeit macht frei sign over the historical gate of the Auschwitz I main camp that was destroyed by thieves has been put back together.
But in this prison, it was really death that set you free. The prisoner enclosure at the camp was heavily guarded to ensure no prisoners escaped, and there was no man's land that was 3 meters wide. The guards at this camp would toss prisoners' caps over the fence, so when they entered the no man's land to retrieve it, they would die by lethal gunfire from the guard towers. When some of the inmates had gotten too exhausted to keep enduring their suffering, they would cross into the land to get killed by the guards. But that's not all that happened at the camp. They started human experiments at the camp. Many prisoners suffered and died, or were just plain executed in medical experiments conducted at Dachau. They conducted hypothermia experiments by exposing prisoners to vats of icy water, by stripping them naked and leaving them outside during freezing temperatures. When the subjects passed out, they would attempt to revive them by putting them inside hot scalding baths or forcing naked women to have intercourse with the unconscious victim. Almost 100 prisoners died during these experiments, and the original records of these experiments were destroyed to conceal their atrocities, which could mean that there were more deaths. They also conducted high-altitude experiments on prisoners in 1942. Victims were subjected to rapid decompression to pressures found at 4,300 meters, or 14,100 feet. It resulted in spasmodic convulsions, agonal breathing, and eventual death. It was during all these that a doctor that had been traveling the world realized that he could do some experiments that would benefit the Nazi government, and not only did he get funding, he got access to the Dachau concentration camp. We're talking about the infamous star of the show, Klaus Schilling. How did Klaus Schilling come to Dachau? This is Klaus Schilling, born in Munich on the 5th of July, 1871. He studied medicine in his native city, where he received a doctor's degree in 1895. He became a professor of parasitology at the University of Berlin, and from there, a member of the Malaria Commission of the League of Nations. A few years after becoming a member, he moved to Africa, particularly Togo, and started practicing in the German colonial possessions in Africa. Schilling was soon recognized for his contributions in the field of tropical medicine and was appointed as the first ever director of the Tropical Medicine Division of the Robert Koch Institute in 1905, and he remained there for 3 decades before moving to Italy. During Benito Mussolini's reign in Italy, Schilling relocated to the country and was given the opportunity to conduct immunization experiments on inmates of the psychiatric asylums of Volterra and San Nicolo di Siena. The Italian government was worried that their troops that had gone to fight against Ethiopia faced a malaria outbreak, and they obviously didn't want it to spread in Italy. Schilling used this as his opportunity to start his malaria experiments and started to discuss with the Nazi German government that they needed this research too. So the Nazi government supported him with a financial grant as he started his Italian experimentation. In 1941, Schilling was convinced by the Nazi health chief of Germany, Leonardo Conti, to return. By 1942, he was offered his own malaria experimentation center at the Dachau concentration camp, and despite backlash for his colleagues, he stayed there for the duration of the war, and that is when the prisoners at Dachau started to suffer some more. Malaria experiment at Dachau. When Klaus Schilling started his experiments, he claimed that mosquitoes causing malaria could be used as weapons during World War II. So he was going to find mosquitoes that would survive outside their natural habitat, and if he is able to, soldiers can drop the mosquitoes over their enemy's base and allow the disease outbreak to do its thing. Malaria is no joke, because even with advanced technology, there were over 200 million malaria cases in 2022 alone, and 608,000 of the people involved died due to the disease. When Egypt eradicated mosquitoes in the early part of 2024, they celebrated because those pesky insects won't just hover around you, they will leave diseases behind. 80% of the deaths caused by malaria in Africa affected children around the age of 5, so it is a terrible experience. So when Klaus Schilling started his experiments, there were many scientists against it, but he had the permission to go ahead, which shows just how inhumane and unethical German soldiers acted during World War II. Apart from wanting to use malaria as some sort of biological weapon, he was also trying to come up with treatments and prevention methods for the disease to protect German soldiers when they go for war in tropical regions. Even though the research was largely for military use, they lacked any regard for the prisoners' welfare, but is that surprising considering that they were already making them live as if they weren't humans? The capacity of the prison had already been exceeded, and the hygiene in the prison was almost non-existent, but the malaria experiments were considered to be much worse than what we can think of. So imagine how bad it was. Test subjects were selected randomly. Jews, Roma, anti-Nazi politicians, or any other marginalized group was forced to go through the experiment with no consideration of their health or consent. But consent meant to the Nazi German government or Schilling, as he infected prisoners by introducing malaria-infected mosquitoes to bite them. When he didn't use mosquitoes, he injected them with the blood of patients who had already gotten malaria to ensure they got the disease. Once the subject is infected, they start to experience high fevers, chills, general body ache, and a loss of appetite. In their sick state, Schilling would administer various experimental drugs in different doses, from high to lethal, to observe the efficacy and side effects. The victims were subjected to repeated infections and treatments, which made them never see the end of their suffering. Many prisoners died from the disease, while others died from the toxic effects of the experimental drugs. Some died from their weakened state, which was caused by repeated exposure to the illness, and since their immune system is not built to handle that level of malaria, they also give up. Prisoners that managed to survive lived with long-term health consequences, including organ damage and other chronic conditions. More than 1,000 prisoners were used for these experiments, and around 300 to 400 died as a result, and a substantial number remained permanently injured. Even some priests were used in the experiments, and although Schilling kept saying that the experiments could be harmless, the aftermath showed something entirely different. However, Schilling was unable to get the answer he was so desperately looking for, as the end of the war signaled the end of his experiments. The end of the malaria experiment. The malaria experiment ended almost as quickly as it started. The end of the experiment started with the liberation of Dachau. As the Allies began to advance on Nazi Germany, the SS began to evacuate the concentration camps in the summer of 1944. This led to the killing of thousands of prisoners before the evacuation, and those that were killed were the sick ones or those who couldn't walk. By the end of 1944, the overcrowding of the camp started to affect the prisoners, and the unhygienic condition, coupled with food rations, became disastrous. In November of that same year, there was a typhus outbreak, which caused more deaths among the prisoners. They continued the evacuation the next year, which was 1945, and they had a new set of rules. Prisoners from the northern part of Germany were to be directed to the Baltic and North Sea coasts to be drowned, and those from the southern part were to be gathered in the Alps, which was where the SS wanted to face the Allies. Former and escaped concentration camp prisoners started an armed revolt in the town of Dachau in April 1945, and the civilian militia joined them. Early in the morning of that day, around 8:30 a.m., the rebels occupied the town hall, but the SS gruesomely suppressed the revolt within a few hours. The SS already knew that Germany would be defeated in World War II, so they invested their time in getting rid of any evidence that would expose the war crimes they had committed at Dachau.
Found with his mistress, drunk and with a suitcase of civilian clothes, planning an escape.
They decided to start getting rid of prisoners, but they failed and forced over 10,000 prisoners to leave the camp on foot, in trains or in trucks. The foot march lasted several days, and more than 1,000 prisoners died on the journey. The Dachau camp finally started to see light at the end of the tunnel when a prisoner fled to get help from American troops. 2 days after fleeing, a Red Cross representative negotiated an agreement to surrender the camp to the US troops. On the night of the 26th of April 1945, a secretly formed International Prisoners Committee took over the control of the camp, and on the 29th of April, German Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker surrendered the camp. More than 30,000 Jews and political prisoners were freed. American troops killed some of the guards after they surrendered, and other officials that they didn't kill were arrested, including Klaus Schilling. After his arrest, Klaus Schilling was tried in a US military court, and this was where he attempted to show his humanity. But how did that turn out for him? Schilling faces trial. In the course of the Dachau trials after the camp was liberated and World War II ended, Schilling was tried by a US General Military Court, which was appointed on November 2, 1945. The case was called the United States versus Martin Gottfried Weiss, Wilhelm Rupert. The defendants, which included 40 doctors and staff, were charged and convicted for the cruelties and mistreatments at Dachau concentration camp and its subcamps. According to some testimonies, the patients used in the malaria experiments were Poles, Russians, and Yugoslavs, but there was no formal code of ethics in medical research that the judges could use against Schilling and his fellow Nazi doctors. Schilling made a plea during his trial as he broke down in tears, begging the court to let him finish his experiments in a less destructive manner. In his words, he said, "I have worked out this great labor. It would be really a terrible loss if I could not finish this work. I don't ask you as a court, I ask you personally to do what you can, to help me, that I may finish this report. I need only a table and a chair and a typewriter. It would be an enormous help for science, for my colleagues, and a good part to rehabilitate myself. The court refused his request and sentenced him to death by hanging. The German medical community tried to protest his case, saying he was a humane doctor, but the evidence proved otherwise. Schilling had his chance to run a humane experiment, but he went the other way. If he truly cared about rehabilitating himself, he wouldn't have done the experiments the way he did in the first place. After his conviction, he told his lawyer not to appeal his case because he would rather die than remain in prison. On the 28th of May 1948, Klaus Schilling was taken to the gallows for hanging. When he was asked if he had any final statements to make, he said, "I am not guilty. Please get it over with." He died by hanging, and his experiments led to the Nuremberg Code, which was a set of rules guiding the process for human experiments. We have come to the end of this video. Do you know of other human experiments that have happened across the world? Let us know in the comments. To expand your knowledge on the world, make sure you subscribe, like and share the channel.